Hello everyone, Shane Vance here. Who doesn't love a good Disney villain? Throughout all the years since the company was established back during the early 20th century, Disney has given us more entertaining pictures than we can count. Most of that entertainment comes from their baddies. Some of these bad guys are as threatening as they are enjoyable. And I am here today to rank the villains from the primary Disney film location, Walt Disney Animation Studios. Also, before I begin, some of the choices in this list will also include characters who more or less act as an obstacle for our Disney protagonists than outright villains, but I'm including them anyhow just to see how they would stack up. Buckle up, because this list is going to take forever to get through. The Agent from Bolt. In Bolt, the titular dog is an actor playing a superhero. The only drawback is that he thinks it's all real and the production crew are dedicated to keep Bolt from finding out the truth. This is enforced by Bolt and Penny's agent, who refuses to let Penny drag Bolt out of the film studio and experience reality. Now, this guy is the closest thing we get to a villain in Bolt, because the bad guy the dog goes up against in his TV show Dr. Calico is merely an actor. That being said, while his acts are pretty immoral, the agent is more of a caricature of how Hollywood agents would act, as he focuses more on publicity, profit, and making sure the actors he's representing follow the will of their filmmakers.
So I can bring Bolt home?
As your friend, I say yes, absolutely. But as your agent, I have to remind you, this is Bolt's world. He has to stay right here. Okay. Let's go.
You could argue he is just doing his job, which to be fair is true, since his department is making sure Penny does her acting role for the show.
I just booked you on the Tonight Show lead guest. That's right. Which means just absolutely nothing if Bolt is still missing. It's not even good news. Like, whatever, so what? The Tonight Show, who cares? I don't care.
Despite this, he is still a pretty crappy person, as he does not take Penny's feelings into consideration after Bolt leaves the studio. He just commissions a replacement for Bolt who is a lot more dog-like compared to the real deal. All of these traits put him this low on the list because the agent has no charismatic qualities that could flesh him out. He mainly serves as a strawman for the movie's commentary about the less-than-appealing sides of the filmmaking industry, where figureheads like him can inconvenience others just to grab his next paycheck. The only praiseworthy thing about him is his defeat. When the film studio ends up being burned to the ground, Penny is forced into an ambulance. The agent tells Penny's mother that he plots to use the incident for publicity reasons, which leads to this moment.
We quit.
No, wait, let's not make any rash decisions. let's put a pin in it.
The agent could have worked better if he was given more screen time, or actually tried to hide Bolt's absence from Penny to manipulate her into continuing on with her job, which would have made him a more effective, or at the very least adequate villain. Due to this, he gets the low spot on my list. Also, on a personal note here, the agent sort of reminds me of Derek Deedle from the DreamWorks movie Monsters vs. Aliens, which came out 4 months after Bolt. Just throwing that out there. Arthur the Insecurity Virus from Ralph Breaks the Internet. In this Wreck-It Ralph sequel, Ralph and Vanellope venture into the internet to acquire a steering wheel for Vanellope's game, Sugar Rush, when the present one gets broken. However, Vanellope becomes attracted to another game called Slaughter Race because she's become worn down by the repetitiveness of Sugar Rush. When Ralph finds out about this, he and his new friend JP Spam Lay ask the help of a virus maker named Double Dan, who introduces them to an insecurity virus named Arthur, who Ralph hopes will mess with Slaughter Race to make Vanellope change her mind. Just to get this out of the way, like a lot of people, I don't really like Ralph Breaks the Internet because its premise is just all over the place, and both Ralph and Vanellope have either been flanderized as a clingy, jealous friend, or a selfish brat who has too much high standards for her home. But getting to Arthur, I will say that he's pretty much wasted potential as a villain. He mainly acts as a force of nature because he was programmed to spread viruses and nothing more.
Insecurity detected. Copying insecurity.
It also doesn't help that he is pretty much forgotten about in the film's third half after he creates the Wreck-It Ralph clones who go after Vanellope, which pretty much opens up a new can of questions. Where's he now? Did he vanish after Ralph resolved his insecure feelings, which got rid of the clones? Is he trying to mess with some other internet location? See my point? The film never explains what happened to him after the conflict has been settled. Originally, there was going to be a more self-aware villain named Bev who served as the main source of security on the internet who took her job too seriously. I'm not saying that this would have made the movie better, but I really would have preferred that over a mindless eating machine like Arthur. I get the film wants to teach a lesson about how you should be supportive of a friend's dreams and how being insecurely dependent on them can lead to disaster, but the way the film handles the message sort of depends on Ralph being the villain.
For real.
Circling back to Bev for a minute, you could have kept her as the villain whose goals stemmed from feeling insecure that a friend of hers had to move on to other things, which would have actually made for a far better villain arc since it juxtaposes with Ralph's feelings of insecurity since Vanellope wants to move on to Slaughter Race. Despite my complaints though, I will say that Arthur has a cool looking design. It looks like a robotic eel with the eye of Sauron from Lord of the Rings. I also enjoy his movements because they are effectively creepy and awesome at the same time. I also found his virus-spreading ability to be cool. Him spreading physical insecurities and make manifestations of emotional ones is pretty awesome to look at.
Distributing insecurity.
Beyond that, however, Arthur is pretty forgettable and everyone would be better off sticking with the first Wreck-It Ralph. Rano from Bambi. Rano is a mean deerbuck who wants to take Feline the doe as his mate, even though she already has chosen Bambi. Rano isn't really the main villain in this movie, that title belongs to man, and he only gets one scene. Rano is yet another antagonist who merely serves as an obstacle for our protagonist to face, which does take away a lot from him. I will say though that Rano is pretty intimidating and scary for a deer. He has this menacing glare that you wouldn't normally associate with an animal as pleasant looking as a deer. I'll also admit that his fight scene with Bambi is by far one of the film's most intense and nightmarish sequences imaginable because Rano actually does put up a fight that might make you think he'll end up victorious. One last bit of praise I got to give Rano is that throughout his whole sequence, he never says a word. I guess it adds into how creepy he is, but I think this was sort of a smart move on Disney's part because we get to see an antagonist let his villainy out without the need of words and gives the audience a chance to figure this out for themselves. Despite all of Rano's redeeming qualities though, they unfortunately aren't enough to put him higher on the list because he isn't really fleshed out. He has the trait of a jealous, entitled bully who wants a girl for himself but with the appearance of a silent movie killer. And before you ask, yes, I know Rano comes back in Bambi too, but I'm only speaking of the original. Cyan AM from Lady and the Tramp. These two Siamese cats are owned by Aunt Sarah, an extended relative of the dog Lady's owner Jim Deere and his wife Darling, and has come to watch their infant boy while they go out for the day. And after Aunt Sarah establishes herself as someone who doesn't advocate dogs, the cats decide to have some fun with Lady by creating chaos around her house and blame her for it once Sarah notices the damage. While Cyan AM only appear in one scene in Lady and the Tramp, they really make the most of the limited amount of screen time they're given with their wily nature and preference for making trouble. Their villain song is also pretty enjoyable to listen to for the most part, as it's this catchy tune with a Siamese leitmotif that you'll find stuck in your head.
We are Siamese, if you please. We are Siamese, if you don't please.
The reason why they're not higher on the list is because in the grand scheme of the movie, they don't add much. Yes, framing Lady does sort of get the ball rolling for the plot as Aunt Sarah takes Lady to the pet store to get a muzzle for her. She runs away and gets into some shenanigans with Tramp. But for the rest of the film, they completely vanish and have no more relevance. If I'm being perfectly honest with you guys, I actually prefer their male counterparts, Devin and Rex, in the 2019 remake that was released on Disney Plus because they have a lot more charisma and their song is a lot more fun to listen to.
Why you so mean? Gave you little room of volunteers. Now we gon' want some credit for this, not blame. Are you mad? What a shame.
Cyan AM have their enjoyable characteristics, but since they don't appear much throughout the film, they don't have many layers beyond those characteristics. Also, I will not mention that whole controversy surrounding them and their ethnic representation, mostly to avoid bringing some controversy onto myself. Lumjaw from Fun and Fancy Free. When the circus bear Bongo manages to escape captivity, he decides to settle down in the forest where he falls in love with the beautiful Lulubelle. However, Lulubelle is sought after by the dangerous and cruel Lumjaw, who wants to dance with her in a ritual that the forest bears use to find a significant other. Now, to be fair, Lumjaw shares many similarities to Rano. They're both big and brutish animals who are fighting another one of their kind in order to force a female member of their species to mate with them. The only difference here is that Lumjaw has more appeal to him. I guess the biggest thing Lumjaw has going for him is that, unlike Rano, there's a lot of slapstick moments sprinkled throughout him menacing the other bears. Plus, you really can't deny that his appearance makes him quite an intimidating foe for Bongo to face.
Well, what's this?
That's where all my praise stops though, because compared to the forthcoming villains, Lumjaw is pretty much not in the same league with them. The one thing he has in common with Rano is that they're both love rivals with the protagonist, and that's about the zenith of his character in general. For real, he's just another pre-Disney Gaston. I guess the biggest thing the filmmakers could have done with Lumjaw is have him try and sabotage Bongo's chances with Lulubelle from behind the scenes. Yes, I know this movie was made in an era where Disney had to make package films in order to survive World War II, but Lumjaw could have been more fleshed out if the directors decided to give him more of a personality. Zeus from Fantasia. In ancient Greece, a party is being held in honor of the god of wine Bacchus. The celebration is disrupted by the king of the gods, Zeus, who proceeds to throw lightning bolts at the partygoers just for his own amusement. Unlike the portrayal of Zeus from Disney's Hercules.
Now, watch your old man work.
This Zeus is more in line with how he was in the original mythology, a selfish, destructive deity whose only goal is to entertain himself like no tomorrow. I placed him this high on the list due to the fact that, despite only getting 3 minutes of screen time, he does have some credible qualities as an antagonist. Like, he's a god, so he can't really be punished for his mischief. I mean, if the partygoers stood up to him all at once, he could kill them with just a snap of his fingers. I also found his design to be rather cool. It has this toga frat boy-like appeal to it. One last thing that I like about him is that the destruction he causes gets quite intense for an easygoing segment in Fantasia. Unfortunately, like most villains this low on the list, he's held back on account of how little personality he has. I understand that Fantasia is an anthology movie that's more about visuals rather than storytelling, but there have been Fantasia segments where the characters manage to charm us with how they shine. Zeus just does not fit in that category. I also have mixed feelings to him deciding to call off his assault on the party voluntarily. It's pretty anticlimactic, but a unique way for a villain to be stopped. To conclude, Zeus is an in-and-out villain that has enough endearing positives to keep him from being ranked lower. Crone from Dinosaur. Crone is a stubborn and prideful iguanodon who is leading a herd of a different variety of dinosaurs to a luscious oasis called the Nesting Grounds. When a meeker iguanodon named Aladar and his adopted lemur family joined the herd, Crone finds himself at odds with Aladar because his stubborn, cynical mindset clashes with Aladar's more humble and idealistic way of handling things. Like showing mercy to a duo of elderly dinosaurs that are too slow to keep up with the herd. Crone is basically the guy who thinks he is right about everything and is intolerant to anyone who disagrees with him. If I'm being perfectly honest, it's this headstrong attitude that's the reason he is this low on the list. Sorry to sound a little biased, but I just hate stubbornness. It's this parasitic personality that brings out the worst in any individual. And from what I've seen of Crone, his prideful nature has indeed brought out the worst in him.
Crone, look. All we had to do was dig and...
Good. Now, get out of the way.
Having said that though, I do actually find it a bit engaging on how Crone's bullheaded personality has become quite a weakness he has. He's so protective and insecure about his pride and role as the herd's leader that he constantly makes foolish decisions. Like he hoards some water found underground for himself rather than letting some of the members of his herd get a drink, which could leave them weak and unable to move on. Then at the end, when the entrance to the nursing grounds is blocked off by a rock slide, he insists that they climb the rock slide in order to get to the nesting grounds instead of thinking of a safer alternative way. He also refuses to join the herd in scaring away a carnivore that's followed them, which makes him the predator's new target in eating. Crone's headstrong tendencies have also made him quite apathetic to the suffering of other dinosaurs, like being willing to leave any weak dinosaurs behind without a second thought in order to protect the more healthy and agile ones.
Connoisseurs, if we don't keep moving, they'll catch up to us.
But the others in the back, they'll never make it.
They'll slow down the predators.
And has also given him this survival of the fittest mentality that's kind of scary for the most part. He's managed to also convince his sister Nira and his second-in-command Breton to think like him.
Why is he doing this? Pushing them on with false hope?
It's hope that's gotten us this far.
What hits close to home is that if you can ignore the fact that he's a dinosaur, Crone's mentality is pretty realistic. There are people out here on Earth who are too stubborn for their own good and see strength as a means to survive while also thinking little of those who aren't as strong as them. One last thing that puts him this low on the list is the fact that he's voiced by the late Samuel E. Wright, who voiced Sebastian from The Little Mermaid. While Wright doesn't use the same voice as Sebastian, I can't help but picture Crone speaking in a Jamaican accent, which kind of takes away the seriousness of his character if only for a bit.
I tried to stop us. She wouldn't listen. I told her to stay away from humans. They are bad. They are trouble.
To conclude, Crone is a villain that you'll find yourselves loving to hate with how much a stubborn jerk he is, but if you can actually see the toxic layers that sort of flesh out Crone, I'd say you'd have more fun seeing him making a fool of himself. But still feel kind of bad that the film didn't do much with Crone other than make him an egocentric tyrant. The aliens from Chicken Little. When laughingstock Chicken Little and his friends Abby, Runt, and Fish discover that an alien spaceship has landed in their town of Oaks, they infiltrate the ship and discover a giant map room that apparently shows the aliens are planning on conquering Earth. When their attempt to notify their peers ends up in a bust, the teens soon discover that an alien child named Kirby has escaped the ship they entered after curiously following Chicken Little. His parents, the leader of the aliens, soon find out that he's gone and launch a search party to locate him, which the citizens of Oaks mistake for an invasion. Now, I know you guys might be saying to yourselves that the aliens aren't really villains since they're just trying to find a lost child of their kind. And in all fairness, I get that any loving parent would want to retrieve their child. But I don't think we should turn a blind eye to some of the chaos that these aliens have created. They invaded a town without warning and ended up scaring the living daylights out of citizens, not to mention abducting some of them.
Oh, we surrender! Here, take the key to the city! Key to my car?
Tic-tac?
Yes, the town of Oaks do sort of deserve some punishment for their cruel treatment of Chicken Little. Especially since they've been giving him nothing but a hard time since he claimed that a piece of the sky fell onto his head and wouldn't move on from it for over a year since then. But I wouldn't say that being invaded by aliens warrants them on the receiving end of karma. The most they should get is being labeled the worst city in the world and given the cold shoulder by other towns and cities. Back onto the aliens though, there are some things to like about them. For one thing, their mech suits are pretty creative and have this charming cybernetic design, alongside having long cable arms and egg-like helmets, not to mention being able to fly by converting their legs into rudders, which makes for a very intense scene when they chase the teens into the corn maze.
Come on!
I also enjoy how cute their true form is when they reveal themselves to the protagonists near the end and how they explain that this whole ordeal was one huge misunderstanding. It turns out they only come to Earth in order to harvest acorns when going to meet with extended family. Heck, they were even nice enough to undo their chaos once everything has been over and done with.
Again, I cannot tell you how sorry we are for this whole misunderstanding.
Oh, dear goodness, we are so very sorry.
What keeps them from getting higher on the list, beyond the fact that they're not really all bad, is the fact that they indirectly had a hand in making Chicken Little an outcast in the first place. Since one of them reveals that a panel repeatedly falls off the ship, which really says a lot about how Chicken Little thought the sky was falling in the first place. It would have been interesting to see Chicken Little call them out for causing his pariah status, but I guess the filmmakers didn't have much time. These aliens are okay at best with their designs and their technology, but in terms of actual villainy, the fact that they're only villains by accident is what keeps them this low on the list. Stromboli from Pinocchio. Stromboli is an entertainer who employs Pinocchio the living puppet to put on a live performance in front of a crowd of people who have come to watch him sing and dance at Stromboli's theater. He turns a hefty profit, but when Pinocchio wants to go back home to be with his father Geppetto, Stromboli's true colors step in and locks Pinocchio in a birdcage so that he can use him to entertain many people across the world to obtain money. I know a lot of people are going to be mad at me for this, but compared to the other villains in Pinocchio, Stromboli is honestly the weakest out of all of them.
Say what?
Don't get me wrong, there's many things to like about Stromboli. He has a very flamboyant and theatrical design. He puts on one heck of a puppet show. And he makes for a great comedic villain, especially whenever he gives out his Italian-spewing temper tantrums. However, when he enters into villain territory, Stromboli becomes quite less interesting. He goes from a short-tempered but quirky businessman to a generic jerk who exploits people for easy cash. While greed isn't necessarily too much of a bad motive for villains, it's gotten to the point where it's kind of been done to death. I know this movie took place at the beginning of the 40s, but as of now, greed is now pretty much a stock reason for doing bad deeds. While Stromboli does say that he will chop Pinocchio into firewood once the puppet grows up and no longer has any more use for him, I can't really say if this threat is either genuine or he's just trying to scare Pinocchio into staying with him forever.
Good night, my little wooden gold mine.
Another thing about Stromboli that keeps him from getting higher is that he's not really precautious trying to keep Pinocchio from escaping, because he doesn't use one of the people on his payroll as a guard to make sure Pinocchio stays in the cage, which enables Jiminy Cricket and the Blue Fairy to free Pinocchio. Finally, for the remainder of the film, Stromboli disappears and we don't know what happens to him. Either he finds out Pinocchio is gone and lost his business, or he finds other ways to make a profit. Stromboli is a memorable character and does sort of play an important part in Pinocchio learning to become a real boy, but he only does the bare minimum when it comes to villainy, and you are only attached to his neutral role before he drops the ball. The Firebird from Fantasia 2000. When a forest sprite ventures into a dormant volcano when her nature-induced powers have no effect on it, she ends up accidentally waking up a gigantic creature known as the Firebird, a lava monster with an avian-like appearance, who proceeds to destroy everything in sight. Now, you can tell the Firebird is just a watered-down version of Chernabog from the first Fantasia. They're both giant deities who represent a less-than-ideal part of life, with the Firebird representing destruction. To get the positives out of the way first, the Firebird has a pretty frightening design, especially since unlike Chernabog, his moves are more fluid since he came out at the start of the 2000s decade. Not to mention that the destruction he causes is pretty frightening in of itself, as the lava he is manipulating ends up enveloping the entirety of the forest. I also think his relationship with the forest sprite is a little interesting, because she's the reason why he's even up and about and chases her down to kill her, because she is everything he stands against. Showing that while causing destruction may be part of his identity, he is a lot more self-aware and can act on personal instinct. Like what I said about Zeus earlier though, the biggest thing that's keeping him back is that he's lacking in the personality department and can be best described as a force of nature gone rogue. Sure, he's voluntarily destroying the forest just to kill the sprite, but you could easily replace him with another deity of destruction and barely anything can change. To reiterate, the Fantasia sequences are known more for style over storytelling, and the Firebird, as awesome as he is, falls into that category because he barely has anything to flesh him out other than trying to kill the sprite who woke him up. Which, to put cynically here, is sort of akin to a person running away from a wild animal they harassed. To conclude, the Firebird is quite a menace in every sense of the word, but being a watered-down version of a more well-known evil being and lacking much of a personality does keep him from getting any higher. Denahi from Brother Bear. In this movie, 3 Inuit brothers, Sitka, Denahi, and Kenai, take on a bear that's stolen some fish Kenai was supposed to properly tie up. To protect his brothers, Sitka causes an avalanche which also ends up costing his life. Blaming the bear for this mess, Kenai goes to hunt it down in vengeance, and after killing it, he is transformed into a bear as punishment for not living up to the totem he recently received, the Bear of Love. When Denahi finds Kenai, he mistakes him for the bear that he and his brothers fought earlier and believes that Kenai was killed. So he goes on a hunt for revenge. Now, I know that Brother Bear is one of Disney's more divided films, and Denahi is one of the reasons why, because he is kind of a forced-in villain just to bring in conflict.
Nahi? It's me, Kenai!
With that said though, Denahi actually has some interesting qualities to him, like his tenacity in tracking down Kenai in bear form is pretty scary yet somewhat admirable. Plus, he's backed up by a charismatic portrayal by the late Broadway actor Jason Reyes, who previously played Simba in the Broadway musical adaptation of The Lion King. His role before turning into the movie's villain is also pretty great because he acts like a goofball who teases his sibling like no tomorrow and getting angry at him when he makes a mistake.
You didn't tie it up, did you? You should have got the totem of pinheads.
Those are about all his positives though, because like most fans, I also found his descent into the movie's de facto antagonist to be kind of rushed and confusing. You see, after Sitka's funeral, he tries to stop Kenai from tracking down the bear, saying that killing the bear won't make anything better. Then when he thinks that another one of his brothers has been killed by a bear, he decides to forego all of that and seek revenge.
I don't blame the bear, Kenai.
The man wouldn't just sit here and do nothing.
Yes, both of his brothers have been killed in the span of one whole day, so of course he's going to lash out at something, but I hardly think he'd be willing to forget about all of that in the name of avenging Kenai. One last thing that keeps him from getting higher is that he is revealed to be the narrator of the film at the opening, but then the movie immediately forgets about this, which leaves a lot of unanswered questions. Like, is the story being told from his point of view? And if so, is he being straight about it or making up the more fantastical elements? All in all, Denahi does have some great qualities to him, but he is held back by a number of reasons, one of them being that he's forced to be the movie's antagonist. Edgar from the Aristocats. Edgar is the butler of the kindly heiress Madame Adelaide Bonfamil. When he overhears Bonfamil tell her lawyer George that she plans on leaving her pet cats, Duchess and her kittens as the inheritors of her fortune when she passes on, with Edgar being second in line after they pass on. Edgar becomes quite frustrated at this supposed injustice. So he decides to catnap the felines and accidentally drops them off in the wilderness after he is attacked by 2 guard dogs. Edgar has been said by many Disney fans to be the weakest Disney villain ever, especially during an era that happened after Walt Disney himself passed away. And to be fair, Edgar does have some traits that make him unable to rank higher on the list. For example, much like Denahi, he started off as not too bad of a guy and was seemingly an ally to the cats, which makes his sudden villain stance feel rushed. Not helping matters is that he, by sheer coincidence, overheard Bonfamil and George talking about his place in her will, and his reaction to thinking that the cats will outlive him is borderline stupidity.
I mean, each cat will live about 12 years. I can't wait. And each cat has 9 lives. That's 4 times 12 and multiplied by 9 times... No, it's less than that. Anyway, it's much longer than I'd ever live.
Plus, he never bothers to check and see if the cats are dead or at the very least very far away from their home to make it back in one piece in order to see if his scheme can go on without a hitch. He also tends to be quite clumsy, which doesn't make him menacing, it just makes him look like a lost member of the Three Stooges, though for some people, this actually makes him one of the funniest Disney villains. And I will admit some of his clumsy antics are pretty amusing to watch.
Let go my key! Oh, please, I'm frightfully sorry, sir.
Don't panic, Edgar. Upward and onward.
With all that said, however, Edgar does have some impressive traits to him. For one thing, despite what I said before about him not checking to see if the cats are dead, it's shown that he was smart enough to retrieve his possessions before any of the cops find them after news of the cat's disappearance has spread, which will most likely pinpoint him as the culprit. Yes, this was mostly to have another chase scene with the dogs, but you can't deny that it was smart of Edgar to do that. Also, when the cats make it back home, Edgar manages to improvise a last-minute plan to get rid of the cats by sending them to Timbuktu, showing that he can adapt and have some quick thinking for any kind of contingency plan. Though this amount of intelligence is sort of inconsistent since he believed that cats have 9 lives. One last bit of praise I got to give Edgar is that he puts up a good fight when fighting the alley cats who have come to save Duchess and the kittens.
You are going to Timbuktu if it's the last thing I do.
Are there any other flaws that keep Edgar from getting higher other than his inconsistent stupidity and clumsiness? Well, yeah. Like what I said with Stromboli, Edgar's main motivation is greed, which, sorry to repeat myself, is an overdone villain motive. To conclude, Edgar is a villain that you can either take or leave. He has his low moments, but also some high moments sprinkled in between. Mr. Winky and the Weasels from the Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. When the mania-addicted Mr. Toad becomes obsessed with driving motor cars, a local bartender named Mr. Winky and his weasel henchmen agree to trade their motor car for Toad's ancestral mansion, Toad Hall. But things take a turn for the worst when it turns out the weasels stole that motor car and let Toad take the fall to go under the radar, with Winky throwing Toad under the bus during his trial for good measure. Now, weasels have always been used as villains in many Disney material, with such productions like Who Framed Roger Rabbit and the Mickey Mouse short The Prince, and the Pauper featuring the weasels as bad guys. But it should be noted that this is the first time Disney used weasels as antagonists. How are they in practice? Well, they are kind of sidelined as villains as Winky sort of gets more screen time just to remind the audience that he's the leader of the weasels.
Step one more. There he is. Get him.
Though to be fair, the weasels in the film's source material, The Wind in the Willows, were hardly anything noteworthy either. They just seemed like villains for the sake of the story having a conflict that isn't Mr. Toad's motorcar obsession. Getting to Mr. Winky himself, I'll admit that he's the one redeeming element of the weasels. He looks like a cartoony con man and actually lives up to that stereotype, always pulling his tricks with an unwavering smile on his face. It sort of gets to the point where it becomes quite creepy because he barely shows any other emotion besides his trademark grin.
Well, Governor, you tried to sell me a stolen motor car.
The weasels also have some charm to them as well because their zany, fast-paced animation and the many facial expressions they have do make for some good comedy, especially in the ending scene where they and their boss gang up to get the deed back from the protagonists. So, why aren't they any higher? Well, to be honest, other than the weasels having only a bit of charm to them despite only being shoved to the side most of the time, there are some things to criticize about these villains. For one thing, Winky's trick against Toad is sort of contrived because Toad just happens to want the motor car he and his henchmen have stolen. Not to mention that Toad is pretty much low-hanging fruit when it comes to a swindle victim because his eagerness and need to feed his adrenaline rush stops him from suspecting anything foul going on. While it's true that Winky is the type of person who would make a quick buck out of anyone no matter how unchallenging and naive they were, this type of a lucky break just feels too much. Overall, Winky and his weasel henchmen are okay at best and mediocre at worst. The Queen of Hearts from Alice in Wonderland. When a young preteen British girl named Alice ends up being lost in the crazy world of Wonderland, she is soon led to meet the land's ruler, the Queen of Hearts, who soon takes Alice to trial when she accuses Alice of humiliating her in a game of croquet. I can't really say much about this villain other than that she's a spoiled child in the body of a middle-aged woman. Just about every time the Queen of Hearts talks, she throws a temper tantrum over the dumbest of things like her life depended on it.
Who's been painting my roses red? Who's been painting my roses red? Who dares to taint with vulgar paint the royal flower bed? for painting my roses red! Someone will lose his head.
I get that this is most likely intentional because sometimes cartoon characters losing their tempers can be funny. For the Queen of Hearts though, her emotional breakdowns can range from either funny to scary or downright annoying depending on the situation. For me, it can go either way. She's not all shouty though, she can keep her composure in any given circumstance, though most of it is just passive aggression.
Do you play croquet?
Why, yes, Your Majesty.
As a ruler, I'd say that she acts accordingly to how we as an audience expect the ruler of a wacky place like Wonderland to behave, completely insane like nearly every other inhabitant of Wonderland. And boy, do we see why being insane while having a position of authority are not compatible with each other in the slightest.
No! The deuce, you say? Not me? The train! That's enough! Up with their heads!
I think one of the most overlooked qualities the Queen of Hearts possesses is how she works as a symbolic figure to Alice. You see, at the start of the movie, Alice quite insensitively does not listen to her elder sister's history lessons and confides in her cat Dinah about how she wants to live in a world that has no logic whatsoever. When Alice meets the Queen of Hearts and becomes put off by her bad behavior, she ends up seeing the kind of person she could turn into if she does not embrace logic and things making sense. What makes this more meaningful is the fact that Alice ended up dreaming her adventure in Wonderland, meaning that her whole experience, the Queen included, was her mind warning her about the effects of her old want for a world of nonsense, which makes the Queen a mental representation of Alice's worst traits.
Sorry, Rule 42, you know.
And as for you, Your Majesty. Your Majesty indeed.
If there are any traits that keep the Queen of Hearts from getting any higher, it would be that the Queen doesn't appear until the movie is at its final half. Yeah, Alice in Wonderland may have introduced many memorable characters like the Mad Hatter, but the main flaw I have with it is that it's more of an episodic story than a movie, and because of that, the Queen of Hearts sort of gives off an impression was that she was made as a Saturday morning cartoon villain. In essence, the Queen of Hearts does have some things going for her like her often amusing temper and symbolic representation, but is unfortunately undercut by the fact that she's barely in the movie until the end. The rat from Lady and the Tramp. At 2 points in Lady and the Tramp, a scary-looking rat intrudes in Lady's yard. The second time it happens, the rat makes its way into the room of Jim Deere and Darling's infant. Lady is chained up to her doghouse so she can't do anything to stop it, so her new friend Tramp comes along to deal with the rat himself. Now, the rat isn't a particularly compelling villain since he's just a wild rodent who wants to survive. However, much like the Firebird, he seems to have some self-awareness to him. Like, he has enough of a will of his own to enter into a baby's room unprovoked. His intent with the infant is unclear. Whether he wants to simply bite him out of sadism or any other reason is not elaborated on. This was probably done on purpose in order to give the audience some suspenseful mystery. I mean, if every mystery in the world were solved, life wouldn't be as fun without any mystery, wouldn't it? To me though, I think this is the rat's biggest weakness other than its small size, because just having a harmful presence without any context does make for a distraction, especially since the rat is as sapient as the rest of the animals in the movie. One thing that I am pretty mixed upon is its design, because it looks too realistic and creepy, especially for a film as saccharine as Lady and the Tramp, but again, I guess that was the intention the filmmakers were going for. Though I will say that his presence is sort of important to the story in more ways than one. Like Lady and Tramp just had a big fight, and the rat threatening the baby is a good show of them deciding to put their differences aside. Plus, when Aunt Sarah pins the blame of Jim Deere and Darling's baby nearly getting hurt on the dogs and has Tramp taken away, Lady shows the humans the rat's dead body, causing them and Jock and Trusty to go find Tramp after the animal control officers take him away. One last thing that makes the rat important is that he provides a rather dark but exciting climax to the story in his fight with Tramp. To conclude, the rat is held back by having unclear intentions and his design is a bit too creepy, but he does play an important role in the movie and I do have to admire his self-awareness. the director from Bolt. The director is the namesake head of the show Bolt and Penny work on. However, he is also the reason why Bolt is so convinced that his role as a superdog is real, because the director is keeping the dog from finding out that all the stuff he does is just part of a television show. Unlike with Penny's agent, the director does have a lot more going for him due to being the one responsible for Bolt's delusions to start with, because he believes that if Bolt is convinced everything on the show is real, so will the audience. He also has a lot more charisma than the agent, all thanks to a campy performance by the late James Lipton.
You see a dog. I see an animal who believes with every fiber of his being. Every fiber!
He's also pretty funny to watch, as his frustrated reactions upon finding out that a boom mic made its way into a camera shot are pretty entertaining.
Boom mic!
We got a boom mic.
It's a boom mic. That's sloppy. The dog could have seen that. He could have seen that.
It is also a little easy to sympathize with this guy as well, because he's just trying to do his job and a network executive is putting pressure on him to boost up ratings lest he get fired. That's where all my praise stops though, because in the grand scheme of things, this guy is pretty much small potatoes compared to the other conflicts of the film. I guess that's because, like some other villains before him on the list, the movie completely forgets about him after Bolt vacates the studio. It would have been nice to see him get some kind of comeuppance, like having a mental breakdown over Penny and Bolt quitting the show after the fire. Similar to the agent, he's more of a caricature on the seedy side of the movie industry, but has enough of a personality and likable qualities that put him higher than the agent. To end things off here, the director has more endearing traits as a villain, like being the one responsible for the movie's conflict, albeit indirectly, along with having some campy and comedic characteristics. But the movie glosses over him almost immediately before the film's second half. Clayton from Tarzan. Clayton is a hunter from England who serves as a bodyguard for scientist Professor Archimedes Q. Porter and his daughter Jane when they go exploring for a hidden group of gorillas in Africa. However, he is secretly planning on finding these gorillas in hopes to sell them off to poachers for the highest bidder. To get some negatives out of the way first, Clayton's only defining personality is his want to kill things, just like your typical hunter villain. His trigger-happy personality basically takes up a majority of his screen time.
Professor, Jane, stand back!
Wait, no!
He also has the generic villain motive of greed, but I think his bloodlust for animals is what adds in some flavor to this. He also serves as a twist villain, something that would be a repetitive Disney trend in the 2010 decade, but I actually think he's an example of a twist villain that doesn't work. As soon as we meet Clayton, he lets the mask slip a little too easily, often making rude statements and being a bit of an arrogant meathead.
Oh, Professor, you are here to find gorillas, not indulge some girlish fantasy.
Fantasy?
However, what Clayton lacks in both subtlety and originality, he makes up for in charm. This is likely due to the performance of the hammy Brian Blessed. Granted, Blessed voices Clayton mostly with a calm, low-key tone of voice that he usually doesn't go for in his acting, but he does manage to pull of his British charm while acting like a gentleman, both as an ally and as a villain once he reveals his true intentions.
Why, for £300 sterling a head. Actually, I have you to thank, my boy. Couldn't have done it without you.
Though, it is nice seeing him go full lunatic during his final confrontation with Tarzan, which results in one of the most horrific villain deaths ever in a Disney film. He also has a very unique-looking design for an Englishman. He's tall, has a large chin, burly muscles, and a small French-style mustache, which is probably meant to distinguish him from any other evil hunter in an animated film. To stop things here, Clayton has his good points, but they unfortunately aren't enough to put him higher on the list. The Droon from Raya and the Last Dragon. The Droon is a species of supernatural parasites who turn every living thing in their way into stone. They were banished from the world of Kamandra by a magic gem orb that was made by the dragons who protected the land, but at the cost of the people in the land dividing themselves from one another. Centuries after, when the head of the Kamandra Heart tribe, Benja, attempts to make peace with all the other nations, a fight breaks out to steal the orb that banished the Droon, since it ended up in Heart's possession only for the orb to break, which enables the Droon to return to Kamandra. Years later, Benja's daughter, Raya, alongside one of the dragons that created the orb, Sisu, need to reclaim the pieces of the orb which were taken by each of the tribes in order to banish the Droon for good. There's not a lot I can say about the Droon because their entire character can be best described as an animalistic deity of despair and destruction, not unlike the Firebird from Fantasia 2000. The only reason why I haven't put them lower is that in spite of their one-dimensional personality, there's no denying that their design is pretty cool. They look like a godlike ocean version of the Blob, and they pose as a serious threat to everyone in Kamandra with their ability to turn all the humans into statues. And the fact that they're made out of purple clouds makes their threat all the scarier. Although, their menace becomes less impressive when it turns out that water is their weakness. Yeah, I know that deities can't be all-powerful, something must be used as a defense against them. But something as mundane as water being that defense sort of makes the hero's journey feel like they're being given a fighting chance since they live in a land overrun with water.
You gotta be kidding me.
The Droon aren't bad as villains who are made up of pure evil and have a pretty frightening design, but the fact that they are simply animalistic deities with a less than impressive weakness keeps me from putting them higher up on the list. Captain Gantu from Lilo and Stitch. Gantu is the captain of an alien federation that is tasked with transporting a dangerous alien called Experiment 626 to a place where it won't harm anyone. However, 626 escapes and hijacks a ship to the planet Earth. Now, Gantu started off more as a throwaway character, a stern, no-nonsense captain of the guards who is just doing his job. The only notable thing about Gantu is that he is as tall as a building and has a whale-like facial characteristic. When he is sent to retrieve 626, now going by Stitch after being adopted by a girl named Lilo, however we do see that he is quite a formidable foe, being able to get the drop on Stitch at least twice.
Little savage, get off my ship!
I know some people are saying that Gantu isn't a villain in this movie, but when he next appears, it would seem that he took Stitch escaping him earlier very personally and is only pursuing the little chaos maker out of payback. Not to mention having voice actor Kevin Michael Richardson give him this very deep, authoritative voice that's right up Richardson's alley.
It is an affront to nature. It must be destroyed!
Beyond that though, Gantu mainly serves as an obstacle for the heroes. I'd say more about him, but given his little screen time and what actions he commits that verify his threat levels, I'd say he's more or less a standard antagonist than anything. Madame Medusa from The Rescuers. Medusa is a pawn shop owner who is seeking to acquire a large diamond known as the Devil's Eye from an underground cavern in a Louisiana bayou. So she employs a young girl named Penny to go down the cavern to get the diamond for her since she cannot go down herself. Medusa is yet another villain driven by greed, which already takes a few points against her. I will say though that there is a little layer to her greed, which is her determination. When her clumsy henchman, Mr. Snoops, tries to convince Medusa to cut her losses and use other diamonds and riches that Penny brought up to sell for a profit, she responds with this.
I want that diamond. I've got to have the Devil's Eye.
She's so determined to get the Devil's Eye that she won't let anything stop her in her path. This determination is also her biggest weak point. Circling back to what I said about Crone a few minutes ago, Medusa's lust for the Devil's Eye diamond causes her to constantly make foolish decisions, like threatening to leave Penny down in the cavern and let her drown when a tide comes in if she doesn't get the diamond. Despite the fact that if she does so, she'll get no closer to getting the diamond. Oh, and her lair being an abandoned party boat seems a little odd but fitting for the Louisiana setting. A lot of her personality comes from the performance she is given by the late actress Geraldine Page, who actually did all of Medusa's lines in a single take. I've never seen her in anything else, but you have to have great acting chops to pull that off.
Shut up! I am taking the next flight down to Devil's Bayou.
She can also be funny as well, like near the ending of the film where her lair blows up from fireworks and she scrambles around like a madwoman trying to escape the chaos.
And your infernal fireworks! You
Getting back to her negatives though, I will say that Medusa's design is a little hard to look at most of the time. She looks rather unappealing. This may be due to her inner ugliness, but you'd think that she'd actually have a design that looks like an average person. She also has some cliched villain moments, apart from her greed, like betraying Mr. Snoops, though due to how cruel she was to him, I bet that the audience would estimate she would do that. And wearing some rather gaudy clothing that you'd expect a villain like her to wear. In conclusion, Madame Medusa has some good points to her that give her texture as a villain, but also enough bad points that might make you wonder if she should be the diamond trapped in that cavern. Madame Mim from The Sword in the Stone. Madame Mim is a witch who lives in a small cottage on the outskirts of the nearby Kingdom of England. When a young boy named Arthur Pendragon is turned into a bird by the eccentric wizard Merlin, he ends up in Mim's home, where she proceeds to torment Arthur while showing off her more cruel ways of using magic before challenging Merlin to a wizard's duel when he comes to save Arthur. Now, The Sword in the Stone isn't really a Disney movie that I was particularly interested in watching all the way through growing up. In fact, it was one of the Disney movies from Disney Animation Studios that I just saw bits and pieces of, and the scenes with Madame Mim were what I watched repeatedly. To start things off here, Mim is another in-and-out villain in a Disney movie, and the major conflict of The Sword in the Stone is Arthur's dilemma of either being a squire for his pretentious adopted brother Sir Kay or learning from Merlin about the importance of intellectualism. And most other conflicts in the film are just predators hunting Arthur when he is turned into an animal. Unlike most antagonists that come and go, however, Mim actually stands out because she's given a good amount of screen time that shows us just how much of a mad madam she is, with her villain song being very fun to listen to.
I'm that ugly old prince, the magnificent, marvelous, Madam Mim.
Despite that though, her scene with Arthur alongside her song do take up a majority of screen time because it's mostly just Mim bragging about her being a better magic user than Merlin while turning herself into many different forms. Though we do see how much of a threat she is when she tries to kill the avian transformed Arthur. It's the wizard duel she has with Merlin that's the most entertaining thing about her, because we see her transform into many different types of animals to get the best of Merlin. But she keeps using big and dangerous looking animals to give herself an advantage, which contrasts against Merlin's practical thinking and using many unimpressive but useful animals in his battle against Mim. Her defeat is kind of underwhelming, but given that she isn't the main conflict of the film, I do think it does serve as a fitting penalty for her. Mim is a textbook example of working in small doses where she makes the most of her limited screen time, but until we get to the wizard's duel. She kind of slows the film down a little bit, and I'm sure audiences would like to see what would happen if she played a more integral villain role in the story. The Headless Horseman from the Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. The suave but self-serving Ichabod Crane has just made an enemy out of the brutish Brom Bones for the affections of a seductive girl named Katrina Van Tassel. To get some leverage over him, Brom Bones sings about a phantom called the Headless Horseman after noticing that Crane has a superstitious side during a party. When Crane attempts to return home through the hollow, he is soon chased by the very Headless Horseman Brom was singing about. The Headless Horseman has more or less become an iconic monster where it has been parroted many times before, but for a majority of people, this was their introduction to the famous horseback rider spirit with no head, and for most people, this movie's version of the Horseman has been considered to be one of the best in both scariness and awesomeness. I guess his introduction scene alone is sort of a testament to that. I also found the Horseman's song Brom has sung to be very catchy and fun too, with Bing Crosby bringing his A-game to the jazz style the song has.
They say he's tired of his flaming top. He's got a yen to make a swap. So he rides one night each year to find a head in the hollow here.
The way he and his horse are designed also does them justice, because they're drawn in such a frightening way that you might actually believe them to be ghosts, with the horseman's chase scene with Crane giving off a horror movie vibe. Why isn't the Horseman higher on the list? Well, like most villains featured in segments rather than actual films, he doesn't make too much of an impact to be considered a villain that goes above and beyond. The evilest he does is just chase Crane in the hollow while trying to decapitate him, and also throw a flaming pumpkin at him when Ichabod makes it across the bridge that separates the hollow from civilization. But this is another complaint I have with the film because it just ends with an ambiguous note on whether or not Ichabod was killed or survived and that Brom married Katrina. I really don't like it when movies leave things up to the viewer's imagination. One other thing that keeps the Horseman from getting higher is the theory that he's really Brom Bones in disguise and is either planning on scaring Crane away or killing him just to have Katrina all to himself. Because there are many implications that lead to the possibility of this theory, but due to being a package film, it isn't elaborated on. In conclusion, the Headless Horseman is pretty awesome for a villain with a short amount of screen time, but is held back on account of many things about him going unexplained. The Kakamora from Moana. The Kakamora are a clan of feral humanoid coconut pirates who seek to deprive Moana and Maui of the legendary Heart of Tafiti, a gem that has the power of creation that Maui stole from the goddess Tafiti many centuries ago. These little guys are another antagonist that serve more as an obstacle for the heroes, but boy do they make an impression. For starters, they have this cannibal-like attitude that either makes you feel scared or amused.
They're kinda cute.
They also serve as effective obstacles for Moana and Maui as they work in numbers, which really gives them an advantage since there are too many of them for our protagonists to fight off. It's also pretty impressive how they seem ingenious enough to create a bunch of small floating islands that can separate into more than one. Plus, each of them has a unique design for their coconut bodies. The one thing that holds them back though is that they only appear in one scene of the movie, and because of that, they aren't fleshed out as antagonists. Also, the way that Maui defeats the Kakamora is sort of unrealistic and based on pure dumb luck. Overall, the Kakamora serve as scary if entertaining guest villains, but their lack of both extensive screen time and personality, along with having an eye-raising defeat from one of the heroes, does make me wish the filmmakers done more with them. The Jack-in-the-Box from Fantasia 2000. In a segment that parodies the Hans Christian Andersen book, The Steadfast Tin Soldier, a living Jack-in-the-Box wants to woo a beautiful porcelain ballerina, but she has affections for a kind-hearted tin soldier with a part of his leg missing. In a fit of jealousy, the Jack-in-the-Box throws a wooden boat at the soldier, which causes him to fall out of a window of the house that he and the rest of the living toys live in. A Jack-in-the-Box is honestly a bit of a predictable choice to make a toy-centric bad because their creepy, jester-like appearance would give any artist leeway to make them a villain. This Jack-in-the-Box is hardly any different because he has such a creepy-looking design that you can tell he's supposed to be the villain. And, sorry to repeat myself again, but since this guy only appears in a segment in Fantasia, he doesn't have enough room to be fleshed out and is just a villain for the sake of a villain. Is there anything to like about this villain? Well, actually yes. He is one of the few villains to have some sort of victory over the hero by making it so the hero is separated from the one he loves. Yes, it's just temporary, but in the grand scheme of things, he won in that moment. Though, the fact that the soldier is only brought back by pure coincidence does sort of make this victory less impressive. Another positive I can say about him is that he is shown to be smart enough to avoid getting in trouble when the soldier's army is nearby and only attacks when he knows he has the advantage. That's pretty intelligent for a villain. I also have to give him some praise for being able to handle a sword once the soldier returns to the room. I do have mixed feelings regarding his defeat though. You see, after the soldier tries to fight him off, the Jack-in-the-Box lunges after him with his sword, but the soldier is apparently strong enough to push the attack off him and send him straight into an open fire where he burned to death. Similar to what I just said about the Kakamora a few minutes ago, I just find it a bit too unrealistic that the soldier had enough strength in him to do that. The Jack-in-the-Box is a passable villain at best, but is held back by having a predictable representation and a defeat that feels very unlikely. Shan Yu from Mulan. Shan Yu is the leader of the villainous Han army who issues a hostile takeover on all of China, seeing the Wall of China as a personal challenge against him by the emperor himself. I know a lot of people have been giving Shan Yu grief for being incredibly one-dimensional, especially for a cult classic movie like Mulan, but I'd like to point out that Shan Yu is, in my opinion at least, one of Disney's most underrated villains. For starters, there's no denying how frightening he is in appearance, from his bulky body, carrying around a loyal falcon as a pet and his eyes looking like they belong to a demon. It would seem that the people at Disney went out of their way just to make Shan Yu look as menacing as possible. He's also pretty smart for a warlord, being able to think of practical strategies when facing off against the protagonists.
We can avoid them easily.
No. The quickest way to the Emperor is through that pass.
He's also more or less the only person in the movie who does not judge Mulan for her gender, only seeing her for the actions she committed in stopping him. While this doesn't mean much, it does show how Shan Yu is never one for underestimating his opponents.
The soldier from the mountains.
Despite all my praise though, Shan Yu does have some negatives. For one thing, the fact that his primary motive is to see a wall that keeps threats like him out as a challenge to his ego does make him rather petty. Yeah, most villains are petty, but you'd think it wouldn't be at this level. Also, and again, sorry for repeating myself, but he and some of his followers managed to survive one huge avalanche that could kill the likes of, say, King Kong. While it is possible to survive an avalanche, I just feel that maybe he survived it a bit too quickly. I guess I shouldn't be too nitpicky in this matter though, since there are some fantastical elements to the movie, like the appearance of spirits and the dragon character Mushu. I also found his defeat at the end to be a bit too over the top, as he is carried off by a giant firework Mushu lit up and into a plethora of fireworks. While Shan Yu couldn't just run away since Mulan pierced his cloak with a dagger onto a roof, Shan Yu still could have jumped on the edge of the roof and hold onto the edge while removing the dagger, or more simply, removed his cloak. Overall, Shan Yu is enjoyable in many ways, but he has enough drawbacks to make me say that he isn't really anything remarkable either. Amos Slade from The Fox and the Hound. Amos Slade is the bad-tempered neighbor of the kindly Widow Tweed and has brought a young hunting dog named Copper, who soon befriends Widow's pet fox, Todd. However, when the two grow up, Todd accidentally causes Slade's other dog, Chief, to get hit by a train and have his leg broken, which prompts Slade to seek revenge after Widow sends Todd away to a section of the forest where hunting is forbidden. Slade is another example of a Disney anti-villain. He's not a good person by any stretch of the means because he treats his dogs rather unnecessarily harsh, but he's also not too bad a person that you would want to see him die. I guess the most interesting thing to say about this guy is that he starts off as a cranky old man, but when Todd ends up annoying him one too many times, he finally goes off the deep end. You might even be willing to sympathize with Slade, well, at least at first, because he has legitimate grievances against Todd, like Todd caused some trouble on his farm when the latter was very young. Sure, Slade could have handled things in a more professional manner, but that doesn't take away the fact Todd still caused a ruckus on his property.
Dagnabbit woman, your thieving fox was after my chickens.
Rubbish and poppycock. I don't believe it. He wouldn't hurt a thing.
You calling me a liar, you muddle-headed female?
I also found his determination to kill Todd in vengeance to be interesting because we get to see his potential as a villain. He's willing to break the law and hunt in an area expressively forbidding hunting to kill a fox for hurting one of his dogs, though he does end up losing some sympathy points on account of how that whole ordeal was beyond Todd's control. Not to mention that both Chief and Slade started things when they tried to hunt down Todd when he wasn't really doing anything wrong at the time. With all that out of the way, Slade does have some negatives to him other than being an anti-villain. For one thing, he doesn't have a distinguishable look to him as either a crabby old man or a hunter villain. He just looks like a generic human being, though given that most of his actions are pretty human even for him, I shouldn't complain so much. Another fault he has is that we don't learn too much about Slade to fully get invested into his character. He just feels like a trope of the grumpy neighbor from nearly every cartoon. To conclude, Slade is one of the most human out of all the Disney anti-villains, but we don't learn much about him to fully consider him to be one of Disney's greatest antagonists. Percival C. McLeach from The Rescuers Down Under. McLeach is a ruthless poacher from the Australian outback who makes a living of skinning innocent animals and selling them on the black market. He is most interested in a giant golden eagle named Marahute, who has befriended an adventurous young boy named Cody. When McLeach finds out that Cody and the eagle are friends, he kidnaps Cody and refuses to let him go until he confesses the whereabouts of the eagle. Now, The Rescuers Down Under isn't exactly a movie from the Disney animated canon that I consider to be memorable. I mean, compared to most films in the Disney Renaissance, most people might not remember it. But that doesn't mean the sequel to The Rescuers doesn't have anything likable about it. McLeach is one of these things to like. He's this hammy and goofy middle-aged man who basically has both the energy and mentality of a small kid. I think McLeach says it best himself with this line.
I didn't make it all the way through 3rd grade for nothing.
Admittedly, the charm of McLeach comes from character actor George C. Scott, who is well known for playing grown men who have so much energy within them, and McLeach is no exception to that. However, he's not all comedy though. He's proven himself to be so dangerous that he managed to imprison at least a dozen of animals that live within the Australian wildlife, and also admits to Cody that he killed Marahute's mate.
That's no secret, boy. You see, I already got the father.
He's also shown to be smart enough to manipulate Cody into leading him to Marahute by lying to him that some other poacher killed her and lets him go under the guise of having no use for him. And earlier, he throws Cody's backpack to a horde of crocodiles to keep the authorities off his tail. I will give credit where it's due. For all of McLeach's good points though, he does have some things holding him back. For instance, he is yet another villain whose primary motivation is greed, since he plans on killing Marahute for the sake of money. Oh, and his design is kind of weak. He looks like a man in his 60s wearing a cowboy hat. That doesn't really scream poacher to me, just an eccentric man-child. Plus, his death in the end is kind of the most stock way a villain like him could die. McLeach is one of the few redeeming elements of The Rescuers Down Under, with his over-the-top personality and cunning intellect, but his lack of a fleshed-out motive as well as his design and death aren't exactly noteworthy. Yokai from Big Hero 6. When young Tech was Hiro Yamada loses his older brother Tadashi alongside a scientist named Robert Callahan in a fire, Hiro and his robot healthcare worker Baymax soon find out that Hiro's nanobots are being mass-produced by a strange-looking man in a kabuki mask named Yokai. When Hiro and his fellow young scientists form a superhero team to stop this menace, they soon find out that Yokai is actually Professor Callahan, who is planning on using Hiro's nanobots to destroy businessman Alistair Cray, who is indirectly responsible for causing Callahan's daughter, Abigail, to get lost in an interdimensional portal. Yokai is honestly a very cool-looking villain. I mean, he looks like a ninja with a demon face mask. Not to mention that he makes great use out of the nanobots he is controlling. I also found Callahan's motivations to be very interesting. Revenge is a very complicated motive for a villain because it can range from petty to understandable. Callahan's revenge sort of falls into the middle category. While we can feel sorry for Callahan since he lost his only child, we also can't fully defend him because in his quest for revenge, he accidentally kills a student of his who looks up to him, and having no remorse for it when Hiro calls him out.
But... Tadashi... Just let him die.
Give me the mask, Hiro.
He went in there to save you!
That was his mistake!
And he was even willing to put innocent lives in danger. While this is meant to teach the audience about what happens when you head down a vengeful path, it also shows how vengeance can begot vengeance. After Hiro finds out about Yokai's real identity, he is extremely angered that Yokai caused Tadashi's death, that he reprograms Baymax to kill Callahan, which makes for a very intense scene, more from the protagonist than the villain. That's all my positives though, because in terms of how he is as a twist villain, I'd say that he is mediocre at best. The way he fakes his death to avoid someone finding him out and explaining how he survived just seems like a lazy attempt at misdirecting the audience, because the film made a rather pathetic attempt at making Cray seem like the one behind the mask. Plus, while his defeat wasn't an easy 5-minute battle, he loses enough nanobots that weaken him enough to allow Baymax to destroy the mask in order to stop his control over the tiny robots, which, while an intelligent way to defeat a villain, kind of feels unimpressive since Yokai basically set the pieces for the heroes to use against him. Yokai did have some potential for a great villain, but is unfortunately held back by having a weak twist and a defeat that, while not bad, could have been better. Willy the Giant from Fun and Fancy Free. Willy is a giant who resides within a castle in the clouds. He is shown to be the one responsible for the kingdom of Happy Valley suffering through a famine, as he stole a magic harp that gave the kingdom life. When 3 of the villagers, Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and Goofy, accidentally plant a bunch of beans that grow into a giant beanstalk, they happen upon Willy's castle. There they find the harp and plan on bringing it back home with them, but have to contend with Willy when he senses their presence in his castle. Willy is one of the more well-known secondary characters in any Mickey Mouse media, as he appeared in many other things after this movie, like being one of the ghosts who haunts Scrooge in Mickey's Christmas Carol. Here in this movie, though, he plays an antagonistic role as a man-child giant who only wants to amuse himself and gets angry when things don't go his way.
Just in case the giant might wake up.
Oh!
Should have let well enough alone.
I think that's the best way to put Willy, since he acts and behaves like a spoiled little kid. However, it's this immaturity that helps make him into a lovable oaf. Disney managed to make use out of Willy's childlike demeanor and actually give him a personality. He's also a little dense, which enables Mickey to distract him while his friends try to hide.
I got you! I think I got you. Yeah, I got you.
Willy!
Willy also has the ability to shapeshift, not unlike Madam Mim, which shows what he is capable of as a giant magic user. He shows off this ability in his Fee Fi Fo Fum song. Speaking of that song, I think it's one of Disney's most underrated and catchiest villain songs. You might find yourself singing along with it when you hear it.
Fee Fi Fo Fum, hee hi ho hum. I'm a most amazing guy, am I? Fee Fi Fo Fum, hee hi ho hum.
His biggest weakness has to be his aforementioned temper. When he finds out Mickey was trying to trick him, he immediately locks him and his friends in a small box that he was using to imprison the harp, which he orders to sing him a song, which she does, making him sleep, giving the heroes a chance to escape. Willy soon wakes up and chases Mickey across the skyland in a very heart-pounding scene. Those were all my positives, now let me say his negatives. For one thing, Willy's stupidity does sort of make the heroes fight against him kind of one-sided. Oh, and the fact that the reason why he got away with stealing the harp in the first place was because he lived in an inaccessible area does sort of give the impression that his villain prowess was due to pure dumb luck. One last grievance I have with Willy is that, again, due to being in a short anthology story, the filmmakers did not have any time to add in some layers to him. Overall, Willy is a fun, dim-witted villain who you can't help but love, yet also can't help but feel that his effort as a bad guy is pretty weak and wish he was in a longer version of Mickey and the Beanstalk. Prince John from Robin Hood. Prince John is the acting king of England while his elder brother King Richard is off leading the English Crusades. However, John's rule over England is a pretty abusive one as he overtaxes the citizens in order to get as much gold as he can. It falls on a roguish fox, Robin Hood, to steal from John and return the money to the citizens before the nightmares of poverty kill them, and Prince John obsesses over catching this fox after being humiliated by him one too many times. Prince John is a prime example of what happens when you give a pampered, entitled so-and-so such as himself absolute authority over a whole kingdom. He uses his power to bully and threaten those who do not adhere to him and thinks nothing of how his actions affect those around him.
For encouraging contributions from the poor. To coin a phrase, my dear counsellor, rob the poor to feed the rich. Am I right?
Prince John may seem like just a typical man-child bad guy, but he actually proves that there is more to him than meets the eye. First off, he arranges for an archery tournament to lure out Robin Hood and even manages to see through his stork disguise, which is rather cunning for a villain when you think about it.
Seize him.
I also think Prince John's design as a maneless lion also works pretty well because his lack of a mane demonstrates his lack of a mature handle on the authority he has. I can also appreciate the fact that John's rule was something that he took rather than something that was given or earned. You see, it turns out John and his advisor Sir Hiss actually brainwashed Richard into leaving, which is pretty sick for a comedic villain like him to do.
Your idea, I hypnotized him and... I know, and sent him off on that crazy crusade.
Also, it's a tad interesting that John's motives range from greed to taking revenge on Robin Hood. It's like the movie itself decided to just go back and forth on what his motivations are, so they decided to try and juggle both of them at the same time. Getting to his negatives, Prince John can get pretty annoying sometimes. I think this is mostly due to how a bit too emotional and immature he acts, especially where his mother is involved. Not to mention his constant thumbsucking can get very grating and cringy to watch. I also feel like that the film only does a shoddy job of handling Robin Hood and Prince John's rivalry, as they only have at least 3 scenes together and their dynamic can only be best described as a carefree boy getting the best of a schoolyard bully. The film also doesn't delve into his complex relationship with his family either. John just hates being compared to his brother and bemoans that his mother always favored Richard over him. That's about it really. In conclusion, Prince John is okay as a comedic but threatening villain and having an interesting take on his motives, but his lack of emotional depth and immature, annoying tendencies do drop him down this low. Hans from Frozen. Hans is the 13th son of the King of the Southern Isles who attends the coronation of Queen Elsa of Arendelle and falls for her younger sister, Anna. During the celebration, he proposes to Anna, much to the objections of Elsa. Eventually, Elsa reveals that she has magical abilities to manipulate ice and runs away, and Hans is put in charge of the castle when Anna goes looking for her. Anna is accidentally struck in the heart by Elsa and is told that an act of true love can thaw a frozen heart. She is returned to Hans to receive a true love's kiss, only for Hans to reveal that he only wants to steal Arendelle from her and her sister in order to have a kingdom of his own. When I first found out about Hans' true intentions when Frozen was first released, I'll admit I was pretty surprised. Looking back on the twist, however, I'll admit that there are some flaws to it. For one thing, the movie has put a lot more emphasis on treating Hans as a good guy. Yes, it's meant to hide his true intentions, but you'd think maybe that the people at Disney would let the mask slip at least once or twice to clue in the audience that something's not right with this guy. Plus, the clues to his true colors are way too subtle that you can easily write off as innocent since there's hardly any meaning to them. Though, I guess the twist could be predictable following his proposal to Anna. As such, when the twist happens, audiences who want to be challenged just find the twist pretty in your face and makes Hans' sudden villain stance come out of left field.
Then she doomed herself, and you were dumb enough to go after her.
Please.
All that's left now is to kill Elsa and bring back Summer.
It doesn't help either that his entire backstory is just explained in a villain monologue. Sure, before the twist, Hans did admit the issues he has with his family.
Wait, so you have how many brothers?
12 older brothers. 3 of them pretended I was invisible. Literally. For 2 years.
That's horrible.
But hardly anyone who comes from an abusive family end up as a moral sociopaths. That twist aside though, Hans does actually prove his villain work by capturing Elsa when Anna failed to do so and kept her imprisoned until she reversed the snowstorm. And was even willing to kill her himself instead of having someone do it for him. Plus, the fact that he gaslights Elsa into thinking that Anna died just to lower her guard is pretty smart and menacing at the same time.
I tried to save her, but it was too late. Her skin was ice, her hair turned white. Your sister is dead. Because of you.
No.
To conclude, Hans is a pretty less than ideal twist villain, but when he does get to play bad guy, he's quite effective. King Magnifico from Wish. King Magnifico is the founder and first king of the Kingdom of Roses who has the power to grant wishes. However, a teenage girl named Asha finds out that Magnifico is hoarding a bunch of ungranted wishes due to him being paranoid of how they'll affect his kingdom. After Asha wishes on a star and a living star comes down to help her free everyone's wishes, Magnifico becomes fearful that Star's presence will threaten his position as ruler and taps into a book of dark magic in order to capture Star. Now, King Magnifico is the most recent Disney villain since Wish came out at least 4 months ago, and as such, he's the only villain on this list who hasn't aged in a good sense or bad sense. But he has enough qualities that put him nearly in the middle of the list. For one thing, Magnifico has this backstory where his family was killed by ruthless bandits and has studied sorcery and created roses just to make people feel safe. Unfortunately, this backstory gets glossed over and is completely forgotten about when Magnifico decides to embrace his villainy, which is unfortunate because that backstory alone could have made him quite a complex and even sympathetic villain. It also doesn't help that when he does play villain, he just becomes the stock, power-mad villain trope we've seen before in other Disney films. Another grievance I have with Magnifico is that most of the villainous acts he commits are usually due to conveniences that are handed to him. Like Asha's friend Simon tells him about Star to get his wish granted, and he has a book of dark magic that he can use at any time whenever the urge to do bad rings in his head.
We know nothing of these pages. You command great magic. But with this book, I fear it commanding you.
Those negatives out of the way though, I will say that Magnifico does have a lot of things to love about him. For one thing, his villain song, This Is the Thanks I Get, may seem very corny, but you can't deny how incredibly catchy it is.
I'd give the clothes off Benito's back. If you really needed that, I'd be the first one to volunteer, Henry.
Magnifico also has a good sense of charisma to him, thanks in no small parts to a brilliant performance by Chris Pine. Despite his charismatic personality, Magnifico can get frightening at some times, like he brainwashes Simon into being his servant and even sends him after Asha at one point. He is also scary enough to intimidate his more benevolent wife Amaya. Plus, his defeat at the end is pretty amazing in one way or another. Overall, Magnifico does have some wasted potential as a complex character, but some of the acts of villainy he commits is pretty good on their own, and he is so charming that you can't help but love to hate him. The Horned King from the Black Cauldron. The Horned King is a monstrous being who rules over a band of thugs and seeks a magical artifact called the Black Cauldron to raise an army of the dead and lay waste to the world. Now, to get the negatives out of the way, this guy is your typical take-over-the-world bad guy that you've seen in nearly every Saturday morning cartoon, which takes a lot away from him in the motivation department. He's also pretty one-dimensional in terms of how he treats his henchmen, with him constantly choking his main sidekick, Creeper.
Escaped? Oh, sire!
However, I will say that the Horned King does have a very frightening design for a villain. He looks like he's not supposed to be a Disney character, more like something out of a Don Bluth film. From his eerie-looking red eyes to his ominous red cloak, you can tell the Horned King owns his villainy. I also found his army of the dead when he manages to acquire the cauldron to be just as scary as him. Another thing the Horned King has going for him is the soft but menacing voice of the late John Hurt.
My, such a brave Vance group. A pig boy, a scullery maid, and a broken-down minstrel.
One last thing I got to appreciate about him is how everyone who knows him holds the Horned King with a great sense of fear, because they know he will kill them or do something terrible if they cross him. It's this reputation that he has built that really shows he isn't someone who messes around. To conclude, the Horned King is pretty one-note, but his design, voice, army, and reputation as one of the scariest people alive does add in a bit of charm to him. Namari from Raya and the Last Dragon. Namari is the daughter of the Chief of Feng, the most prestigious location in Kamandra. When she was young, she faked friendship with Princess Raya of Heart in order to steal the water gem, which instigated the return of the Droon. Years later, an older Namari is hunting down Raya in order to steal the gem pieces as well as kidnap Sisu the dragon in order to take credit for getting rid of the Droon and restoring Kamandra in order to restore her homeland's reputation to the other tribes. Namari has been said by others to be a bad example of a complex character, given that the context of the movie is that the characters need to start trusting her despite not doing anything to earn it. I see their point, since the whole mess was Namari's fault, yet the movie gives her enough screen time to actually see her side of things. She is under intense pressure from her mother to put the well-being of her homeland first before all of Kamandra, and not just that. But her mom is so intent on taking credit for reuniting the gemstones and bringing back Sisu in order to redeem Feng in the eyes of everyone in Kamandra. So really, Namari's misguided actions are mostly due to her upbringing. I'm not saying that justifies them in any way, but labeling her as an inherently bad person is kind of stretching it. Also, her relationship with Raya is pretty interesting, as they sort of play this cat and mouse game when going after the gem pieces. They both want the same thing but go about it differently. It's this rivalry that's one of the biggest selling points, because we are watching this aggressive young tomboy chase down a determined soul while understanding things from her point of view.
Namari! Let's finish this, Venturi.
Outside of all those positives, I will say that Namari does have her weak points too. She seems to be always nearby when Raya finds a gem piece, which causes a confrontation scene to happen, making for a very repetitive narrative. Also, she never apologizes for all the trouble she caused. And also, who could forget the scene? To conclude, Namari is a pretty complicated character and anti-villain, but she suffers from a repeating storytelling structure, and the fact that she kills off a lovable comic relief keeps her from getting any higher on the list.